Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, the Pelicans will be in the Bay Area tomorrow searching for gold after a big win that might have helped stabilize a once troubled franchise. We'll look at the birds on the rebound tonight. Real Pelicans might have found less to rebound from over the last 5 years. This Monday is the 5th anniversary of the BP disaster. We will explore the economic impact. We'll also examine developments in the case against St. Bernard Parish President David Peralta, the latest from the legislature, and Uber service takes to the road. On board with us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. Richard Thompson, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. And David Hammer, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. We're going to go over to Stephanie first. And the legislature began its session this Monday. They heard from our governor. What was their reception, and what did the governor have to say?
Well, he didn't, it's not really like the State of the Union where people are applauding all the time. He did get some applause when he said, "This will be my last session." And then he joked and he said that's not really an applause line, and I think it was somewhat joking. But I have to say, not great reception in general to his agenda. The governor, this is where he lays out his agenda. He basically says, these are my priorities. He does this every year. There was some discussion about whether he would really be talking to the people in the room, his own constituents, or really kind of talking past them to people in maybe Iowa. I personally think he was talking to people in Iowa more than people in the room, and I think some of the people there thought so too. But he did lay out he talked about 3 different areas. He didn't really get into healthcare, higher ed, these areas that, legislators are just having such angst about because there's such a funding shortage. He did talk about the budget, so, that's related, but this is interesting. I don't know that any of us have ever heard him come out and talk about corporate welfare before, but it turns out he's very much against it, and he's not going to stand by and let the state give away all this money, even though he's been doing that for 7 years.
Supportive of it.
In supportive of it, yes. So basically what he was saying was we have a $1.6 billion shortfall. We've talked about that many times. There are some proposals he is willing to support, and they are, again, we've talked about this, in line with this no new taxes pledge. So what he's looking at when he looks at all the different tax exemptions is the areas where there are companies that don't pay taxes and yet get a check from the state, refundable tax credits. So in his calculation, that is not a tax. It's a spending issue, not a tax issue, so that makes it okay. So he basically said, I want to, there's a $500 million pot of money. The problem is a lot of that is this inventory tax credit, which is a really complicated issue. It's supposed to come up Monday in the legislature. Not his version of it, which is interesting, another person's version. This is a tax that is paid from businesses to parishes, and the state rebates it. So he's saying the state should stop rebating it because a lot of those companies, or at least to the extent that they, companies get more than they pay. The problem is those companies are still going to have to pay it. They're still going to have to pay to the parishes, but the state won't be rebating it. So it's an effective tax increase for those companies unless they repeal the whole thing, which is going to be on the agenda Monday.
And the whole thing means that the parishes are really going to take a hit.
Exactly. So a lot of legislators are saying that might be the way to go, but we have to do something to help make the parishes whole, and that doesn't help you with the revenue problem.
And so to do away with it altogether, does any of this require a vote of the public?
Yes, the doing away with it entirely would. So then there's the issue of how quickly could all this happen? A lot of the discussion, there are a lot of bills looking at different exemptions. I think there are some legislators, I have to say I'm somewhat impressed, I don't say that very much, at how many people seem to want to do a real evaluation of what we should do with our tax structure. One of the problems is this is an election year. Another is that, some of these things wouldn't work their way through the system very quickly, and we need money right now. And, some of these changes wouldn't necessarily result in money right now.
So the attitude of the legislature toward the governor, are they getting a little braver and want to stand up to him, or is this re-election issue kind of going to stymie?
Yes, and I don't think they have a choice. I think he's basically said, well, I proposed something, now it's your turn. They're saying,
are the protests about higher ed cuts and everything taking any root? I mean, is there any chance of any changes on that tack?
I think probably longer, in terms of structural changes, probably longer term, probably beyond this year. Certainly there will be people who will be looking at consolidation, things that are difficult politically. The cuts, well, unless you find revenue. And again, the governor wants everything to be revenue neutral, except for these exceptions that he's carved out. We're just going to be slogging through a lot of bills. I thank my colleagues who are going to be sitting through the meetings, up in Baton Rouge. It's going to be tough going, and we don't know. Something's got to give. We don't know what it's going to be. Probably cigarette taxes. I have to say, if I had to bet, I think we will have an increase in cigarette taxes, which are very low, the third lowest in the country.
But there's another issue that's jumped in there, and that's the religious freedom legislation.
Exactly. So the governor talked about 3 issues. One is Common Core, which we all know is a big issue of his as he's talking to the people in Iowa. He went on, I think he said, federal intervention or federal government 5 times in 4 sentences. I mean, it was very much on the nose. The third issue is really interesting. This kind of came up after the big fight in Indiana and Arkansas, where there was some religious freedom bills passed, religious freedom, that basically would have allowed companies to maybe not participate in, for example, same-sex weddings, provide flowers, things like that. That was kind of the idea behind them. They could have possibly been used to deny service to people.
And
there was
a
huge backlash.
Yeah,
and both governors and in North Carolina, governors are retreating all over the country. Our governor supported them. And then out of nowhere, there's a guy named Mike Johnson, who is a brand new representative. He was just elected. This is his first session. And he filed a bill that was somewhat similar. It basically would say the government cannot punish, deny licenses, things like that, to a company that is, has sincere religious views about marriage. It's been kind of narrowed to be about same-sex marriage, which was he kind of did to placate the people who said, well, what about interracial marriage? But on the other hand, it really targets certain people.
So quickly, how is this playing with the legislature?
Not great. I think they would like to see it go away. Nobody wants to take a vote. Nobody wants the backlash that these other states felt, which we're starting to see. IBM in Baton Rouge has a big facility in Baton Rouge, wrote a very harsh letter basically saying this would hurt us, it is not in line with our corporate philosophy, don't do this. The governor wants to do it. He wants to win. He is out there, he wants to be the candidate of these issues in the presidential race. It would go away, except it's now his issue, so it's not going away. They have to deal with it.
Errol?
No, just in Indiana, they kind of got smashed because they also had the Final Four.
Yep.
And the Final Four became provided some leverage in forcing.
Right. Well, one thing, the Convention and Visitors Bureau, the head Steve Perry wrote a very strongly worded letter also saying, this is a huge, first of all, morally we shouldn't do this, but financially we cannot do this. We cannot take this risk. So there's a lot of pushback. Mitch Landrieu is against it. John Alario, the Senate president.
So where is it now?
It is going to committee. The author is going to make some amendments. It's going to a House committee. John Alario, the Senate president, has said we don't even know if it's getting to the Senate. Okay. I think there's very little, even though probably a lot of them would be fine voting for it, I think there's very little appetite for this. But the governor is pushing it, so it'll be a test case to see how powerful he still is.
Okay, this is just the start,
yes.
The first week of the session. Much more to talk about in weeks to come. Thanks a lot, Stephanie.
Sure.
All right, David and Richard, you both have been working on the 5th anniversary of the BP disaster and different implications of that. First, I'll go to you, David. You had interviewed the different administrators and got their take on what they think has been done thus far, largely looking at payouts to individuals and businesses. What are you finding?
Well, first of all, they paid out a tremendous amount of money. Ken Feinberg was the first administrator who was there not under any kind of court order. It was an agreement that BP made with the White House to go ahead and start getting payments out the door. And Feinberg was tapped to administer this $20 billion fund, and he paid out $6.5 billion in 18 months. Then he was replaced by Patrick Juneau because there was a settlement in court. And he was tapped by the court to run that program, and he's paid out $5.4 billion. It's been a lot longer process because there have been a lot of challenges by BP in court, delays while they appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court on some issues. But it's undeniable that this big payout has gone out there. The problem is I talked to certain types of claimants, people who are affected by this delay that was caused on business claimants specifically, and you're talking about tens of thousands of claims that are held up by that. So it's kind of this dual result. You've got some people who came out ahead from these payments and did quite well, and you have other people who are struggling and saying, where's my money?
And the people who did quite well, in what arena generally was that?
Tourism got a lot of money directly from BP and grants, and then in addition, if they had losses, they were able to show those pretty quickly. Landowners was another group, coastal landowners, and certain types of fishermen. One of the things I got into with Ken Feinberg in my story last night was, were fishermen forced to take He instituted this thing called the quick pay. It was in December 2010, and it said basically, if you got an emergency payment, you don't need to give us any more documentation. You can get $25,000, but you wipe your hands clean, no more suits against BP. And thousands, including 10,000 fishermen, took that payment. And one of the complaints that you heard from fishermen was, we did this under duress. It was Christmas time right after the spill. There was no work to be had in fishing itself because the fishing waters were closed still at that point right after the spill. And we're desperate, man. We got to get some money and food on the table and presents in our kids' hands for Christmas. And they took it. And Feinberg is adamant that there was no duress, that he was really looked into that and was sure that that by and large people were taking this money because they just simply didn't have further documentation of further loss.
Well, we're all still really looking at exactly what impact did this have, economically and environmentally. Economically, I know that you've been looking into that, and you're going to have a story coming out this Sunday. What are you finding out?
Well, that's still one of the bigger unknowns for BP as it approaches the 5-year mark of the spill. They'd like to contend at this point they've spent about $28.5 billion between the cleanup and the response and settling some of these private claims. They feel like it's enough, but they could still face billions more in Clean Water Act pollution fines, as well as from the Natural Resource Damage Assessment, which involves hundreds of studies and scientists that are looking at ways that the environment was damaged by the spill and what it'll take to kind of bring it back to where it was.
Well, BP's position about the health of the Gulf, what is it? What do they say?
Well, BP released a report on their 5-year mark about a month ago, and largely from their perspective, things are back to normal, is how they've kind of portrayed it. But just even days after their report had come out, David went down to, where were you?
At Grand Terre Island, East Grand Terre Island.
Where there was a big tar mat.
Correct, 25,000 pound tar mat. And Richard and I both went back out there again a few weeks later, and remnants of that tar mat or more tar that would pop up because it's buried in the sediment and then it pops up when the sands are washed away by the tides was there again. And so the idea that this is out of the environment because we don't see it as much as we used to is not accurate. I mean, scientists have established that there's a lot of oil still in the sediments. In fact, there was this 10 million gallons that was identified in a bathtub ring around the original site of the wellhead. That's way out offshore, 50 miles offshore. It doesn't really affect the ecosystem as much, but we're seeing higher dolphin deaths, and I found these dead dolphins as we talked about on a previous show.
So for BP to say the Gulf is normal, does that benefit them in terms of fines?
Well, yes, it does, and because there's two different things coming up. We already have, they've been found grossly negligent in causing this spill by Judge Carl Barbier, and he's going to be ruling soon on how much to fine them on the civil pollution fines, which are based on the amount of oil spilled and on whether how grossly negligent are they? Are they going to be fined at $4,300 a barrel or something less? If it's $4,300 a barrel, they're looking at $13.7 billion just on those fines. Then you have these environmental damages that Richard mentioned that is going through this scientific process, and some people are saying that could be in that $6 to $10 billion range. And the issue that BP has is that they set aside $43 billion for the whole thing, and they're already at $28.5 billion. And with these things that are on the docket, it looks like they're going to be pushing $50 billion if it comes in at the high end.
Meanwhile, scientists still consider...
The dolphin death certainly pushes an emotional button. Didn't BP respond that there was a high incidence of those deaths before the incident?
They said that this...
was there something out there that would have caused that before the incident?
There was this virus called brucella that they pointed to that was identified as one of the causes that started in February 2010, 2 months before the spill started. But the scientists and NOAA just came out and said that it was a contributing factor based on the data that they've got, showed that in highly oiled areas like Barataria Bay, you had a 4 times higher incidence, and that therefore it was one of the factors.
So the science continues on it, the scientific study to see what the impact really was.
Correct.
Thanks a lot, David and Richard. Errol, over to you, talking about the other kind of Pelicans right now who are making the town happy.
Yeah, this is an upbeat story. Look, what happened Wednesday night, if you think through, especially as we're approaching this 10th anniversary of Katrina, and if you think about professional sports and the saga during Katrina, here we were, endangered, at least afraid of losing the Saints to San Antonio, and the Saints played in San Antonio for that season. The Hornets, because of damage to the arena, David Stern had to find some place for them to go, put them in Oklahoma City, which had never entertained having an NBA team, but they did have an arena. So these two key cities in the evacuation of New Orleans all of a sudden became factors all together Wednesday night. So we're playing San Antonio, and we beat San Antonio, and by doing that, we eliminated Oklahoma City. And of course, what happened to Oklahoma City was that they loved the Hornets, and there was a lot of talk that George Shinn, who owned the Hornets, would just want to keep the team there. And it really seemed we were in danger of it. And ultimately, it was a team in Seattle that moved there because they had an arena lease. But all three of the cities were just a factor in what happened. But what really feel good about it is if you look at the history of the Hornets in New Orleans has been troubled. I think Katrina, of course, was that, and George Shinn ran into financial problems, and there was that season where the NBA actually owned the team, and then Tom Benson, and no one knew what that meant. But I finally think Wednesday night, this franchise hit an element of security. Anthony Davis is obviously just a superstar. Now, we've had stars before, like with Chris Paul, but during the time that Chris Paul was here, his rookie year was the Katrina year, and he spent his first 2 years in Oklahoma City, and he was a nice guy, but he always knew this wasn't a stable franchise where he would win a ring. And now I think I
feel like we have been blessed since Katrina with stars coming at the right time. You think about Drew Brees, and to a lesser extent because of the immediacy was Reggie Bush after the storm. But Drew Brees being, a real superstar, all-time great player, and then you get Chris Paul, and when they came back from Oklahoma City, they ended up having some amazing runs in that 2007-08 year where they went and lost in the 7th game to San Antonio and looked like they could have a chance of going to the conference finals. And then now you got Anthony Davis, and it's just comes together at the right time.
But even at that, through all that, I don't think the community fully embraced the franchise up to that point. But I think now there is something to embrace because now they're familiar with this team. Those first few years, it was, who are these guys? All right? And now they know who these guys are. Now they're playing the team with the best record in the NBA. And there's a high probability that they won't get past the first round. But to finish 8th, there are some towns if you finish 8th, they can fire the coach. Okay, to finish 8th is a real moral victory.
Save the coach's job.
I think it probably did.
I think it's a great thing for the future of this team.
We have to wrap this up. But so there's tomorrow night first game and what?
Tomorrow
afternoon.
Tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah, and then there's going to be at least 4 games because they're 4 to 7 series. So it's tomorrow and then Monday, and I think the first home game will be next Thursday.
All right, Errol, thanks a lot. Richard, David Peralta, the St. Bernard Parish president, more legal woes we learned today.
Yeah, it was a good and bad week for him, it seems like. Earlier in the week on Tuesday, state prosecutors announced that they were dismissing a sexual battery count against him in St. Bernard. And they had initially asked to delay the trial, which was set to start on Monday. The judge had denied that, so they decided to dismiss it. He quickly claimed victory on that. And then in court this morning, his lawyer announced that he's been informed that a grand jury is being convened now in East Baton Rouge, and that President Peralta is the target of that. So that would be the 4th grand jury to be convened in the last year against him, 2 of which have produced indictments at this point, and 1 is ongoing in St. Bernard.
So 1 in St. Tammany, 1 ongoing in St. Bernard. Is there a trial date set in St. Tammany? And that was for a stalking, and this is all involving his ex-wife.
His ex-wife. The charge in St. Tammany, the stalking charge, is set for trial in June in Covington.
And so East Baton Rouge, I mean, the state attorney general is handling this case, right, in the prosecution?
All 4 of the cases, yes. And so that was a real question mark. I mean, that was the first time that we'd heard about this grand jury, and even his attorney, Martin Regan, said that he'd only learned about it yesterday. So there's naturally a lot of questions about, what could they be looking at in Baton Rouge and why that jurisdiction to begin with. The grand jury that's ongoing, even Tuesday they met as that initial charge was dismissed, is considering anything from malfeasance in office to witness intimidation to other charges too.
Well, anytime an elected official interacts with state government, it influences Baton Rouge. It goes through Baton Rouge, and so there might be an angle right there.
It could be the AG's office is looking for perhaps a more friendly jury pool to try to present the charges to. I mean, there's a lot of questions about it at this point.
And his attorney, Dave Peralta's attorney, Martin Regan, I believe is how you say his name, also claimed that perhaps there was some perjury that was involved?
He also claimed this morning that there was perjury involved on behalf of President Peralta's now ex-wife in that initial grand jury that met that had eventually charged him with the sexual battery. And so what he's looking to do on Monday, there will be another hearing that will consider unsealing that testimony. And once it gets to that point, he's talked about filing a federal lawsuit against the Attorney General's office, claiming that his rights were violated.
So more layers, more layers, more layers.
It continues.
Complication. Okay,
in
Richard,
meantime,
thanks a lot.
is he running for re-election this
He
year?
is. In the
Still?
meantime, he is still running
Says
for
he's
re-election in the
election.
fall. He reiterated that this morning.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Richard. Stephanie, over to
Yes.
you. Quick look at upcoming elections, talking
Yes.
about elections, but statewide elections.
Always. Okay. Well, some news this week. Obviously, we're in the middle of a big governor race. It's moving pretty quickly. One thing that happened recently that was interesting was that State Treasurer John Kennedy, who is a very prominent figure. He gets in the news a lot. He has raised a lot of money, over $3 million. Some talk he might get in the governor's race or maybe the attorney general's race. He's, one of these guys who's looked at other races a lot over his career. Has run for Senate twice, once against once against David Vitter as when he was a Democrat, once against Mary Landrieu when he was a Republican. He did say he's going to run for re-election this year. And that, it kind of points to the possibility that maybe he's looking at another Senate race, some people are thinking, because it's Louisiana. There's always another election around the corner. We have a governor race this year. We have a Senate race next year, and that's David Vitter's seat, whether David Vitter is the senator or not. Let's say David Vitter is not. Let's say he, hypothetically, he becomes governor. He is going to have the opportunity to appoint his replacement. Once he becomes governor, because the governor does that. There's a theory circulating, and I think it's a good one now, that what he might do is, rather than appoint someone who's an ally who could then run as months later as an incumbent, he might appoint somebody who would not run for re-election, and that way he kind of takes care of a lot of different people. And one of the reasons maybe it looks that way is some of those people he might take care of are now endorsing him for governor. You have John Fleming, who is the Tea Party congressman from the northern part of the state, who's supporting David Vitter, who would like to run for that seat, he said. You also have Charles Bustani, who is a congressman also from Lafayette. I wouldn't call him a moderate necessarily, but if you look at Louisiana's Republicans, and it's mostly Republicans in the delegation, Fleming is one end and Bustani's the other. He's an ally of John Boehner. He is, more of an establishment figure. Hasn't always been close to David Vitter in the past. David Vitter was actually close to the Tea Party guy that he ran against, Jeff Landry. But Bustani has now come out and endorsed Vitter, which was maybe a little unexpected given that there are other Republicans in the field. There's actually one from his home base, Lafayette. Not Lafayette, but Acadiana, Scott Angel. I think things are shaping up. David Vitter is one of these guys who is always so many steps ahead of everybody. I think I see that. I think that might be what's happening.
Why couldn't Governor Jindal, I mean, we know Jindal and Vitter don't get along. Why couldn't Jindal appoint the replacement before Vitter takes office?
Because Vitter does not have to resign from the Senate until he becomes governor if he's elected.
Oh.
So, and that's what's going to happen. Yes.
Okay, Stephanie, thanks a lot. Errol, we now have UberX in the city of New Orleans. Why don't you explain?
We have UberX and we have Uber. UberX is if you want to ride in a fancy car, and Uber is if it's okay to ride in a less fancy car. I think what distinguishes Uber is that it's app-related. The way you call for a ride is you get out your smartphone and you press the app that you've registered for, and then it's supposed to come in, and then you can get the service. It also calculates your rate. New Orleans was at a point it really couldn't. This is something you can't say no to because everybody's doing it. I mean, you can't be a big tourism city and have all the big tourism cities in the country and gradually in the world having Uber service, and New Orleans not having. I mean, Baton Rouge has it, Lafayette has it. I mean, everybody's going to have it, and so we can't be the one place that doesn't have it. Now, the people on the taxi cab side weren't happy about this, and the Uber people weren't totally happy with the final legislation because there's still some questions about insurance and liability, and so there's some questions that need to be worked out. What Uber cannot do is it cannot respond to people standing on the corner and hailing a taxi. It can't do that. It has to respond to an Uber or to an app. It can't provide airport service because that's a major part of the taxi business. But the whole future, the whole relationship, I mean, you can go on the internet and you can see volumes about the debate between taxis and Uber in the future, not just in New Orleans, but worldwide. I mean, this is a decisive moment, and taxis are going to probably have to kind of redefine themselves. I will say this. A couple of weeks ago, I had to pick up a friend at the airport, and I went to that holding area, the cell phone area, which is also the holding area for taxis. And so at any point, you have maybe 100 taxis in there waiting to be called over to the airport side. And I was noticing all the taxis were really nice looking. Just about all of them were SUVs. The taxis used to be old and beaten up and
There are
dirty.
new regulations now.
They forced them to do that.
Yeah.
Which they were not
absolutely.
happy about either. So they're getting it on both ends.
But you can see the difference that taxis look a lot better, and to the extent that I can see the driver looking in, I mean, they weren't these disheveled people. I mean, and so it seems like that the taxis are upgrading. They're into the business too, and this is going to force it to happen even more.
Thanks a lot, Errol. All right, it's time right now, guys, to look ahead. Let's go first.
Yeah, the U.S. Mint has a program about developing quarters with an American the Beautiful theme, and this week they're going to announce a quarter based on Louisiana, the Cosachi Forest.
That's so
and
nice.
That's a wild turkey flying Cosachi Forest. In the Cosachi Forest, and that's a longleaf pine in the background. So that's going to be unveiled in Alexandria this week.
Great. Thanks, Errol. Stephanie.
Early voting starts Saturday for a number of local elections, not huge ones, but early voting. It's the election is Jazz Fest Saturday, so you might want to do it. One of the things on the ballot in New Orleans is a library millage, 2.5 mils over 25 years. Libraries are in big trouble. They're saying if they don't get this money, they might have to cut back hours even more, maybe shut some branches. If they do get the money, they're hoping to rebuild the last branch that was damaged after Katrina in the 7th Ward, and maybe even open on Fridays some of their branches. Okay. Wouldn't that be nice?
Thanks, Stephanie. Richard.
The city's new smoking ban goes into effect next week, so be curious to see whether bars go along with it, whether there may be some pushing and shoving along the way, or if a last-minute lawsuit might block that for now.
All right, David?
And I have one more piece in our three-part series with the Advocate on BP, the 5th anniversary, airing on the anniversary Monday, about the future of offshore safety and what's been done since the spill to protect us offshore.
Okay, WWL and also the New Orleans Advocate. Thanks a lot, you guys, for being here, and thank you all for joining us. We want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.